How did Nazi Germany afford it? The tanks, the aircraft, the uniforms, the bunkers, the rockets, and the war itself. In 1933, Germany was a defeated, nearly bankrupt country. 6 million were unemployed. The economy was in shambles. The Treaty of Versailles had gutted its military and imposed crushing reparations. Yet in just 6 years, Hitler built one of the most fearsome military machines the world had ever seen, and he did it in secret. The answer begins with deception and debt. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany's economy was still staggering from the Great Depression. Unemployment hovered around 30%. Investment had collapsed. The Reichsmark was barely stable. And rearmament, strictly forbidden under Versailles, was a diplomatic red line. But Hitler had no intention of obeying it. Rearmament wasn't part of the plan. It was the plan. Germany would rearm, reindustrialize, and prepare for total war. But it couldn't be done openly. Not yet. So the Nazis invented a shadow system, one of the most sophisticated financial illusions in modern history. In 1934, Hitler's economics minister Hjalmar Schacht designed a plan to finance Germany's massive rearmament without setting off alarm bells at home or abroad. At the center of that plan was a fake company, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, better known as MEFO. MEFO had no offices, no employees, and no products, but it had one purpose: to issue IOUs. Instead of paying companies directly for military contracts, the German government gave them MEFO bills, promissory notes guaranteed by the Reich but hidden from official records. These notes didn't appear on the national budget. They didn't count as inflationary spending, but they allowed the Nazi regime to pour billions into tanks, aircraft, munitions, and steel, all under the radar. And it worked. Factories roared to life, steel output surged, unemployment collapsed, military production ramped up at breakneck speed. Between 1934 and 1938, over 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of MEFO bills were issued, the equivalent of tens of billions of dollars today. It was secret debt disguised as a miracle recovery. Banks were forced to accept MEFO bills as collateral. Companies could trade them or convert them into cash, and because they were backed by the Reich, no one dared refuse them. The illusion of prosperity took hold. From the outside, Germany looked like a nation reborn. On the inside, it was already mortgaging its future. The workers were next. Germany's labor force had to be brought under control. Strikes were banned. Independent unions were dissolved. The Nazi-controlled German labor front replaced collective bargaining with discipline and obedience. Wages were frozen, prices were fixed, consumer goods were limited, and yet the factories stayed busy, building the machinery of war. Millions were put to work on state projects, autobahns, synthetic fuel plants, arms factories, and later massive military facilities. Workers were paid in Reichsmarks. Companies were paid in MEFO bills. Banks were ordered to go along, and as long as production continued, the bills kept rolling over. But behind it all, the German economy was dangerously imbalanced. Civilian production was being squeezed, imports were tightly controlled. Rationing quietly crept in years before the war even began. The government could no longer pay its debts with actual money, only promises. So the only way to keep the system alive was expansion. As Hitler's armies began to march, first into Austria in 1938, then into Czechoslovakia in 1939, and into Poland later that year, a new source of wealth opened up: occupied territory. Every country Germany invaded became a revenue stream: Poland, France, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Greece. Each was forced to pay an occupation fee, compensation for the cost of being invaded. These fees were enormous. France alone was billed 400 million francs per day. The money went directly to the Wehrmacht and German industrial planners. It wasn't about security, it was extraction, and it didn't stop there. The Nazis looted national gold reserves, emptied banks, seized industrial equipment, and shipped it back to Germany by train. Rail cars full of copper, rubber, tin, steel, oil, and grain were stripped from the occupied East and West. Paintings, artifacts, pianos, radios, livestock, all taken. Anything that could be melted, melted. Anything that could be burned, burned. Anything that could be sold, sold. And there was one more, darker source of revenue: the Jews. Jewish property, businesses, bank accounts, and personal assets were systematically seized under the Nazi policy of Aryanization. Thousands of Jewish-owned firms were transferred to regime loyalists or German corporations. In many cases, Jews were forced to sell at pennies on the mark and then deported. often to their deaths. It wasn't just racism, it was robbery on an industrial scale. All of this, the MEFO bills, the labor control, the occupation taxes, the looting, kept the Nazi economy alive. The German public never saw the full picture. They saw full employment, rallies, military parades, and new highways. They didn't see the IOUs. They didn't see the hidden debt. They didn't see the system buckling under its own weight because war had become the economy, and eventually the illusion would shatter. By 1942, the illusion of financial strength had worn thin. The MEFO scheme was no longer viable. Germany's hidden debt had reached catastrophic levels. Interest payments alone were swallowing vast chunks of the Reich's budget. Tax revenues couldn't keep up. Raw materials were running out. And yet, war production had to continue. So the Nazis turned to a darker solution, one that had been growing since the early days of the regime, but now took center stage: forced labor. Germany's industrial war machine, from tanks to aircraft, from bullets to boots, increasingly relied on human beings taken from across occupied Europe. Civilians were rounded up and deported. Prisoners of war were reclassified as laborers. Entire communities were emptied to fill quotas. By 1944, over 7.5 million foreign workers were toiling inside the Reich, more than one-fifth of the entire German labor force. They worked in factories, mines, farms, rail yards, and munitions plants. Most were unpaid, many were beaten, few were fed adequately, and then there were the camps. The SS, which had once operated mainly as Hitler's bodyguard unit, had evolved into a massive corporate empire, complete with its own industries, construction firms, and banks. Under Heinrich Himmler, the SS turned the concentration camp system into an engine of exploitation. At Auschwitz, Dachau, Mauthausen, and hundreds of other camps, prisoners were forced to manufacture weapons, dig tunnels, and extract resources. They were leased to companies like E.G. Farben, Krupp, and BMW for a fee paid directly to the SS. These weren't secret deals, they were contracts, legal on paper, genocidal in practice. One of the SS's most grotesque creations was Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke, the German earth and stoneworks company. It built roads, dug quarries, and ran brickworks using death camp labor. The profits flowed into SS accounts, bypassing the regular state budget entirely. The SS had become a state within a state, and it was making money off human suffering. As the war ground on and the death toll mounted, slave labor wasn't a supplement, it was a necessity. Without it, German industry would have collapsed years earlier. But by 1943, the signs of collapse were already showing. The Allies were bombing German cities. The oil fields of the East were out of reach. The rail lines were strained, and the Nazis' looting model had a fatal flaw. You can only steal once. Once a country's reserves were drained, its gold taken, its banks emptied, its people deported, it had nothing left to give. The goose was dead. There were no more golden eggs. As the Red Army advanced from the east and the Western Allies broke out of Normandy, territory that once funded the war effort now cost Germany dearly. Retreating troops needed supplies. Destroyed infrastructure had to be rebuilt. Rearguard actions drained ammunition. The Reich, once flush with stolen wealth, now had to borrow, print, or steal just to keep fighting another week. Hjalmar Schacht, the architect of the MEFO system, had long since fallen from grace. He was dismissed in 1939 after warning that the Nazi economy was headed for disaster. His replacement, Walther Funk, lacked his predecessor's cunning and gave the SS and the Nazi treasury unchecked access to whatever resources remained. Desperate for cash, the regime ramped up gold seizures from Holocaust victims, even smelting down dental fillings, jewelry, and watches, and deposited it into secret Swiss accounts. But by late 1944, even that wasn't enough. The Reichsmark began to lose value. Inflation returned, black markets exploded, rationing collapsed. German civilians who once believed in the economic miracle began to face the truth. The house of cards was falling. Meanwhile, Allied troops marching through France, Belgium, and Holland discovered the price of Germany's war economy firsthand: warehouses full of looted goods, trainloads of stolen art, burned out factories once manned by foreign laborers, ledgers and manifests that detailed the industrial scale of exploitation. In Germany itself, as defeat loomed, major companies scrambled to destroy records, hide assets, and distance themselves from the regime. Executives who once toasted contracts with SS officers now prepared defense strategies for the war crimes trials they feared were coming. And when the Third Reich finally fell in May 1945, so did its fraudulent economy. The Nazi financial system, once hailed as a miracle of recovery, was revealed to be a network of IOUs, looting, slave labor, and lies. The MEFO bills were worthless. The Reichsmark collapsed. German banks failed. Billions in value had vanished. Only the ruins remained. What Hitler had built was never a stable economy. It was a weapon, one aimed not just at foreign nations, but at truth itself. And once the weapon was spent, all that was left was the cost. In the aftermath of Germany's unconditional surrender in May of 1945, the Allied powers didn't just send soldiers and engineers, they sent auditors, investigators, and war crimes prosecutors. What they uncovered in Nazi archives, bank records, and corporate ledgers painted a picture not just of a military regime, but of a fully industrialized criminal economy. At the Nuremberg trials, entire categories of war crimes were defined: crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, crimes of aggression. But one lesser known tribunal focused on what made the war machine possible in the first place: economic crime. Executives from companies like IG Farben, Krupp, and Flick AG stood trial not just for collaboration, but for financing and fueling a regime built on theft, enslavement, and annihilation. They were charged with knowingly profiting from the Holocaust, using slave labor, and enabling illegal rearmament, often in exchange for government contracts and protection. The evidence was overwhelming: factories built inside concentration camps, contracts signed with SS officers, bank transfers that corresponded to mass deportations. Businesses had been paid in stolen gold. Profits had been recorded from the leasing of forced laborers who never returned. At the center of these findings was the undeniable truth: war for Nazi Germany was not just policy, it was profit. The MEFO bills were ruled fraudulent. The German state had built its rearmament program on a system of shadow accounting, borrowing from the future and disguising the present. Historians later concluded that the German economic miracle of the 1930s was a mirage, fueled by debt, silenced by propaganda, and ultimately paid for in blood. Post war Germany was forced to reckon with the consequences. The Reichsmark was scrapped. The economy had to be rebuilt from scratch under Allied supervision. Major firms were denazified, at least on paper. Some executives served prison terms. Others rejoined their industries in the 1950s with little consequence. But the true cost was measured not in currency, but in lives. The Nazi war machine ran on stolen wealth, forced labor, and systemic violence. From the top brass in Berlin to the accountants in Munich, from the soldiers at the front to the steel mill owners in the rear, the economy was built to sustain conquest until there was nothing left to conquer. Today, historians study the Nazi economy not as a model of efficiency, but as a case study in unsustainable militarism. It remains one of the clearest examples in modern history of how a government can manipulate markets, enslave labor, fake prosperity, and weaponize finance to achieve total war. And in the end, the system collapsed, not because it was defeated in debate, but because it was defeated in battle. The debts could no longer be hidden. The stolen gold could not buy back lost territory. The factories stood empty. The Reichsmark burned in barrels. And the empire that claimed to last 1,000 years fell in 12. That is how Nazi Germany funded its war machine, and that is why it failed.